You do not color a good image. You shoot one. If you're a DP that thinks that grading happens after the shoot, you've already missed the mark. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to think like a colorist, how to have the mind of a colorist before you hit record, and how to bring your image and your vision to life in DaVinci Resolve with a clean and really effective node tree. So before we even crack open the computer, let's talk about setup. And I'm not talking about in Resolve. They come to you as a DP and ask you, what are we doing visually for this project? Your first step should be to look over the script and see what story that scene or that film or the music video that you may be doing is telling, and you immediately collaborate with your art department and your wardrobe to see how can we best get the most color out of this image without having to use lights. Once you figure that out, once you get with that team and decide, okay, in this scene, this person is supposed to be sad, even though their surroundings are warmer and have a warmer tone, let's contrast their surroundings by having them wear a blue shirt, or vice versa. If they are supposed to be standing out in a crowd full of people, everybody around them is going to wear black and white, and they're going to have a colorful wardrobe on to show that they are standing out from the crowd, to show that they are different. Next, let's look inside of your camera. Are you shooting in log? Are you doing what's necessary to make sure your image has the most flexibility in post so that the colorist has something to even work with? Also, what LUTs are you previewing on your monitor on set so that you can have an idea of what is going to show as your final image after the color grade? Essentially, you know how to expose this image or how to light this image to get the best look, because you already know what it's gonna look like finally, or you have an idea of what it's gonna finally look like. Now that we figured all this stuff out, now that we figured out the pre-production and the production things out, now let's take a look into Resolve. The first thing you're gonna come over here and do is come to your color management and make sure that we are in the correct color science. I tend to keep mine in DaVinci YRGB, and I mainly keep my timeline color space at DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate. And because I use a Mac, I tend to keep my output color space at Rec 709A. If you don't do this, when you export your footage, it is going to be grayed out and washed out even after you grade your footage. Let's demystify this color page by just breaking it down into 5 parts. 5. The first part is the viewer window. This is where you monitor your grade and where you visually see all of the changes that you're making. Next up is your node editor. This is basically where you add your nodes and are able to have a representation of what you're changing and where. Basically how the node structure works, this is where most people get confused and quit DaVinci Resolve, is that whatever you put in the first node feeds into the other. So whatever you do on one, say I do make everything just blue, it fed into all of these 4 nodes. So this is your input over here where it says media out 1, and this is your output. So say, let me reset that node. I was to make that change right here on this 3rd node. It did not affect nodes 1 and 2, but it affected node 4. So whatever you do at the first one, it feeds into the rest of them. The next part of your color page that is super important to understand is your primary wheels. This is essentially where you make your adjustments to lift, gamma, and gain, or your highlights, your midtones, and your shadows. This is where you do like the big adjustments to those things. The next thing and next important piece is your curves and your qualifiers. Now, depending on how your screen is set up, this may be in the center and your primary wheels may be on the left, but my screen isn't big enough. So curves and your qualifiers make the minute adjustments, make the small adjustments to colors, tones, and just specific reasons that you can select out using your qualifier. The final part to your color page that is super important are your scopes. Your scopes essentially give you a scientific representation of what your eye can't see. Let's equate it to using like false color. False color is basically a scientific representation of how your exposure is set up. That's the same as what scopes are. Scopes use the same elements that your false color uses, which is from 0 all the way to 100, and gives you a visual representation of your IRE levels. So your waveform, for instance, you can see your IRE levels on this left and right side. This is the darkest parts of your image, and this is the brightest parts of your image. And you can see as I wave this qualifier across here, it shows you where each thing sits. Now that we know the 5 main parts of the color page, we're able to then go into figuring out how to set up a node tree. So there are a few different types of nodes. There are parallel nodes, which are just one node after another where one feeds into another. Then you have a parallel node, which simultaneously adjusts, and then it blends into the next nodes. And then you also have a layer node, which is useful for combining looks, combining keys, or windowed regions as well. And then you have outside nodes, which, or if you key something out, it inverts that what you keyed out and makes it to where you can affect the opposite region. The only 2 nodes that you're going to be using are the serial node and the parallel node. You can throw the rest of them away for now. So let's get into building an actual node tree. This is a node tree that I use from project to project and that I use on my reference monitor as a power grade. I start off with about 8 nodes. So these 2 nodes here are going to be my CST in and my CST out node. All your color space transform does is take your footage out of that log format and puts it into a space that you can work in and then export in. So first you're going to drag that color space transform node into your node here, Sony sgamut3.cine, which is my input color space, slog3, which is my input gamma. And then I'm going to output to DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate. The reason I output to DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate is because I want to put it in a working space that is most recommended by DaVinci Resolve, just to create a lot more flexibility in terms of what I can do with in this in and out node in the color space transform. So when I do my CST out node, I'm just going to take whatever the output color space and gamma from here, and I'm going to do the input node on here. And then for my output color space, this is what color space I'm going to export into. That is going to be Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. So the next step I would do after I have my node tree set up is to add noise reduction. Once you're working in these log formats, it increases your chances for having noise in the shadows. So you add noise reduction so that you can essentially denoise your image. We're going to come to our effects window and then type in a noise reduction, and it should pop up. The only things I adjust right here are making this better and then putting it at about 45. It's honestly dependent on how much noise I actually have, but for this image I'm gonna put it at about 30 because I'm not seeing a bunch of noise in my image. And if you zoom in there, you can kind of see what this has done to clean up the noise in our image. Then I come down here to spatial and your noise reduction really softens your image. So what I tend to do is to come before the CST out node and sharpen my image to add that sharpness back in there. And I usually keep this on the default setting. Really quickly, I want to discuss the difference between color correction and color grading. Color correction is essentially taking what went wrong on set or what things happened badly that you couldn't control, whether it be because of time or resources or lack of lighting, and you essentially just try to fix those with color correction. Your color grade, on the other hand, is creating the look that pushes the story. Let's talk about the color correction process first. So first thing I usually correct is exposure, and then I come over and adjust contrast, and then I also adjust my white balance. Usually these are the things that you usually try to correct, because sometimes the contrast ratio wasn't right on set, or the exposure was just a little off, or your white balance was a little off. This isn't a fix to bad footage. This is to adjust what was a little bit off. So typically what I would do with exposure, I like to keep my highlights between 85 and 75 IRE on these scopes here. I'll come to my waveform and kind of make sure I'm gauging it properly, and I'll come to my HDR wheels, and then I'll click right here and make sure I'm in the correct color space that the camera was in. This is not affecting your image, but this is affecting how the wheels interact with your image, so that it actually, when you bring it down a stop of light here, that's actually how much a stop of light was in your camera. And since I overexposed by 1.7 stops because I shoot in log, I typically bring this down to correct for that. And you can see the effect that this has had in kind of taking away how washed out that image was and the color was, so I don't have to essentially add saturation within my image in the color grading process. The next thing I tend to do is to add a bit of contrast. This is something that I typically do to kind of just add a little pop to my image. Because I did light this image properly, I don't need as much contrast, because it is the correct contrast ratio between light to dark. Usually what I'll do with my white balance is I'll come over to my vector scopes. The reason why white balance is so important is because it affects how your skin tones look, how rich they are. It affects what story your image is telling. So it's important that you have the correct white balance to get started with correcting your image. Essentially here with this RGB lighting, all I'm affecting is how red or how blue I want my image to be. And because I lit it properly and correctly, I don't have to affect my white balance. Next thing that we're moving on to is our grade. Let's start with saturation. To add saturation to my image, I usually come over to the hue versus satin node. The color I'm trying to intensify here is that blue, so just adding a little bit of that blue there. The next step that I take is I add a bit of film grain, and I drag that film grain over. And usually the film grain I use is a 16 millimeter 500T. It is an indoor shoot, so I'm going for the 500T film grain, and I usually keep that default. The next thing that I add into my image to grade it and give it like a look is halation. And I typically keep this on default. DaVinci's, the way they have it set up, you can just literally drag and drop most of these film look settings. And a lot of times with halation, you also have a bloom effect, but they don't have a bloom effect in the color page. So the next best thing is your glow. The composite type that I tend to go for, each of these have a different effect and have their time and place where you can use them. But just to add like a blooming effect, I'll make it for soft light, and then I'll come over here and turn the shine threshold all the way down so that I'm getting the most out of that effect. You can see that my highlights have become boosted, so I'm going to turn the gain down within this just so I bring my color back and my saturation back, and I'm going to push my gamma so that I'm getting her back in the image and she's not darkened. After this, I tend to come and do my power windows. So I'll create a serial node and then create a few parallels. So I'll come over to my power windows, and typically with your power windows, you use them to relight your image, essentially. The first step within my power windows is to come over and create a vignette. I'll place this where my subject is, maybe a little bit bigger just in case she moves. You can also track this if you would like to. But I just tend to make it a little bigger so I don't have to put as much processing on my computer. And then I'll make this softness about 60, and then I'll invert this node so that what I'm affecting is outside of what I've selected. And then I'll come over here to my gamma, which is my midtones, and I'll bring them down. And as you can see, it's not affecting her in this image. It's only affecting what's outside of what I have selected. And for today, this is all I'll do with my power windows. It's a vignette because I like how I lit this image. I've lit it pretty well in the production process. So each node has its own job. So just keep it simple, keep it readable, and keep it to where it's client friendly and modular, so that if your client calls and says, yo, I want to turn the halation completely off, or I want to turn the grain completely off. I don't want no grain. I don't like grain. You can just come here and simply just hit the button and grain is gone. Versus if you just were to just get out of hand and just do all of these adjustments in one node, and now you got to hit Command Z a bunch of times and be confused about what you did where and for what and how. So just keep your stuff labeled, keep it organized, and that's the most important part of grading. So if you're a cinematographer and you are coloring your own work, please don't treat this like it's just part of just finishing your look. No, treat it like it's part of your craft. Treat it like it's just important as lighting the scene, or just as important as how you expose your image or how you block the scene. It's an important part of the finished product. So treat it as such. Get to know it so that you, when you're on set with the eyes of a colorist, knowing that in post, I'm going to want to bring up the color of their shirt. But if their shirt is gray, then I ain't got no color to bring up. So just treat it as another part of your craft, as another tool in the handy belt to separate yourself from everybody else. Don't overthink it. Don't overguess it. Just create different. Peace.